Hey, so fighting games are awesome.
That is bullshit blazing. Still my heart is blazing. If the word kill me, I
The only issue is, well, I don't know how to play them very well. I've had a bit of an awkward relationship with fighting games over the years, and every once in a while I'll pick up a game because it'll stand out to me because it has a cool character in it, or it just looks fun to play, but then after only a few hours I'll put it right back down and I'll rarely feel motivated to pick it back up again. Even Smash Brothers hasn't been immune to this process for me. Sure, Smash is probably my most played fighting game, if you want to call it that, but even if you do, I still rarely play Smash outside of occasionally booting it up to just sort of mess around with friends from time to time as a party game, and even then I rarely feel like I actually know what I'm doing with it. Now, a sane person would maybe just give up at this point. Maybe fighting games just aren't for me, despite my admiration for them as a concept.
Am I so out of touch?
But I still keep trying, because I think that there's still something that fighting games could be doing that would finally help get players like me on board with them.
No, it's the children who are wrong.
But seriously, it's a pretty common general consensus that fighting games are a fairly niche genre. The best-selling traditional fighters of all time, Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, still pale in comparison to even just regular entries in other genres like first-person shooters, let alone true mega hits like Battle Royales. So, what is it exactly about these games that creates the stigma and makes it so hard for so many new players like myself to get on board with them? Well, I'm sure that there's plenty of people already typing up explanations in the comments below just from hearing that question. And there's some common tropes that people bring up in these kinds of discussions, so let's go over some of them real quick. Some would say that it's the controls being too complicated for a new player to learn, and that there are simply too many moves for them to memorize. Others claim that it's due to the 1v1 hyper-competitive nature of the genre, making it so that you have no teammates to blame for your failure. Others still may claim that it's due to the genre being unique in that it requires the player to spend a lot of time dedicated specifically to practice or labbing to refine their skills, maybe even rewatching footage of past games to learn exactly what they did wrong. Now, I won't deny that these games can make fighting games hard to approach. They are all definitely factors, but I think that they're a bit overstated. Lots of games have complicated control schemes and lots of things they need to keep in your head, ranging from spectacle fighters like Devil May Cry to complex first-person shooters like Doom Eternal to insane real-time strategy games. If pure complexity was the issue, you'd think that games like those wouldn't be so well known and easier to approach by more people, and regardless, while I'm sure that dumbing down the games could make them more approachable, I don't think that you necessarily need to sacrifice complexity to make fighting games more approachable to newbies. As for the competitive teamless nature of the genre, I mean, would you really want to go back to the late 2000s or early 2010s and try to make that claim when first-person shooter games with a free-for-all deathmatch game mode were basically the hottest thing around? Not to mention that today, the Battle Royale genre is still more popular than God, and not only does that usually have you working alone against up to 99 other people, but literally only one person can win a given round, so you would think that a game with a 99% loss rate would be far less appealing than another game that tries to keep you at least a 50% loss rate. And with the labbing and practice stuff, I mean, it's definitely true that I can personally attest to the fact that when I boot up a game, I don't want to be spending my first few hours just in a white void practicing moves. But at the same time, games like Monster Hunter are one of my most favorite franchises of all time, and I'm happily willing to spend hours practicing new weapons or combos in that game's training area, or even just hop in for a few minutes at the start of a play session to warm up. So what gives? How come I could enjoy all of these other complex or competitive games like Devil May Cry and Monster Hunter, and yet fighting games just keep eluding me? And I'm not trying to say that it's a some of these issues are greater than the whole sort of deal either. Well, I think it comes down to the fact that AAA fighting games typically lack any kind of proper single-player campaign. Now, that may sound like a kind of weird criticism because, I mean, most fighting games do have a single-player mode. But I'm talking about a real single-player campaign, not just some kinds of simple arcade mode. See, what this really comes down to is the nature of fighting game tutorials and how they engage their players. Fighting games have had famously pretty terrible tutorials in the past. Even the games that I often see touted as having the best tutorials in the genre are still pretty lackluster in my opinion. And that's because fighting games often treat the tutorial as this thing that has to exist completely divorced from the rest of the game. Like you have to go to school before you can graduate and actually get to have fun. But the best tutorials are often far more subtle than that. In fact, virtually every game with a lengthy single-player campaign is using techniques to teach players as time goes on through gameplay, often without them even realizing it. If you need examples, I'm sure that I don't need to be the 578th person to make a video on the brilliant level design of the first Mario game's famous 1-1 stage, but it's true that almost every single Mario level in existence does this flawlessly. You ever wonder why the first time a new stage gimmick or mechanic is introduced, it's usually in a place where it can't hurt you, or if you mess up, you won't actually fail the level? It's because it's letting the player toy around with the mechanic in a safe space, letting them naturally learn how it works through gameplay, and then as the level goes on, it will introduce harder and harder challenges using that mechanic until it usually caps everything off with a relevant boss fight, where you're tested on your game knowledge, and the only way to make progress is to use what you've learned up to that point. This sounds like a fairly basic example of level design 101, but this is something that is not unique to Mario games. Portal is another classic example of how a game can be 90% tutorial and still be enjoyable, with many people not even realizing that. Plus, this applies to how most single-player games are structured as a whole. It's used in virtually every single genre of gaming in existence, except fighting games. More often than not, fighting games structure their tutorials like their homework, which makes them exceptionally boring and feel like a slog to get through. And more often than not, they fail to really convey the reasons why you would use a mechanic, for the same reasons why a lot of kids get bored in school. Usually the player only memorizes what they need to know to advance, and then immediately forgets it by the next lesson, instead of applying it effectively. I mean, I personally played so many missions in Guilty Gear Strive's tutorial, and I didn't even realize that you could block anything other than air attacks with a normal guard due to the structure of the tutorial failing to properly convey how blocking worked. And then when you graduate from your boring homework missions, usually the only single-player mode to try and test your skills in is a fairly generic arcade mode where all you do is fight bad AIs of increasing difficulty, which can often be cheesed and beaten without actually learning anything. Some fighting games will bother to invest in some flashy cutscenes and have an expansive and maybe even well-written story attached to their single-player mode, but at the end of the day, the actual gameplay just boils down to some basic series of fights against increasingly difficult AI opponents. Now, just adding flashy cutscenes will work for some people because this is ultimately about player investment. If you don't mind me taking a page out of GameMaker's toolkit, according to George Fan, a developer for Plants vs. Zombies, generally speaking, the more invested a player is in your game, the more willing they are to dive into the game systems and actually learn how to play. This explains why a person like me is able to enjoy labbing in a game like Monster Hunter because I've already been playing it for dozens of hours, but I loathe the concept of doing the same thing in a fighting game because it asks me to do so right off the bat. The investment just isn't there yet for me. Ultimately, every player is different, and what they need to reach the level of investment necessary to start spending a lot of the time in the game actually learning its systems will also be different. So just having a big, intricate story with high production value cutscenes can be one way to invest players into your game. I know Mortal Kombat in particular pretty much only exists because of its spectacle and its absurd amounts of gore, but it doesn't actually do anything to properly teach them how to play. So even if you draw someone in with your big show-offy storyline, they still have to use the game's limited tutorial tools or even outside resources if they want to actually learn how to play properly. Otherwise, they may play through the whole story of the game, learn basically nothing from it, and then all of that built-up investment goes to waste when they get dominated in the multiplayer and end up dropping the game forever. What fighting campaigns really need is a real sense of mechanical progression. Not necessarily in terms of like RPG mechanics where you're leveling up and then you can punch harder, but more in the sense of starting out with very few moves in your moveset and then adding more moves over time. And as you gain more moves, you can present the player with challenges that encourage them to use those moves in appropriate situations, teaching them the proper use through gameplay instead of a boring dialogue box. And the fact that AAA fighting games seemingly just don't do this is, I think, one of the biggest reasons why fighting games remain niche. I mean, imagine if someone took a game like Half-Life or Doom Eternal and designed it like how fighting games are designed. You'd have a button on the main menu that would lead to a bunch of boring dialogues that would just tell you what all the different mechanics are, and give you a basic rundown on how to use them, and then it would dump you into the story with your complete arsenal for minute 1, and have you fight every complex enemy in the game simultaneously, and just hope that you can figure it out on the fly. It would be complete madness, and chances are most players would have no idea what's happening or how to use all their abilities effectively. There's obvious reasons as to why games don't do this. You get one weapon at a time in Doom and virtually any other game like this, because that way you can get a feel for it, understand its ins and outs, and really understand its use cases, and then after you get a weapon, they usually introduce enemies that are weak to that weapon in some way, encouraging you to use it in specific ways. You get a grenade launcher, you fight Kaku demons that die if you lob a grenade into them. You get a rifle, you fight the spider brain things whose main weapon can be disarmed with a well-aimed sniper shot, and so on and so on. And some games will keep this really simple. You ever wonder why Half-Life 2 starts you out with you getting off a train and wandering around the city? It's not just because it's trying to do some world building, it's because the game is assuming that you have literally no idea how to play a first-person shooter. So it's starting you off with 0 weapons and enemies, and just focusing on making sure you know how to move and look around. So it gives you a safe space to learn the basic controls, and gives you different kinds of challenges that don't require you to even fight anything or use weapons to make sure you know how to play the game's fundamentals. Then, when you do finally get a weapon, it's just a crowbar. Why? Because that's the simplest weapon in the game, since you barely have to aim it and it doesn't require ammo. Then, over time, the weapons you get more complicated and more versatile. But each time you get a weapon, you have plenty of time with just that weapon to learn how it works, and you're provided with challenges that fit that weapon's nature perfectly so that you can learn how to use it without even realizing that you're learning something. I think it's entirely possible to design a fighting game campaign the same way. There's a common misconception I see in a lot of videos talking about single-player modes in fighting games, which basically conclude that it's not worthwhile to develop them because you cannot possibly make an AI that's as capable as a human player, and therefore there's no way to make a single-player mode that's useful as a teaching tool. But that's just the complete wrong way to be thinking about it. Say I want to teach the player about using things like anti-air as an example. Well, first I'd simplify their moveset so that they pretty much only have some basic punches and kicks and the anti-air move that I want them to learn. Then I'd have a bunch of enemies whose primary strategy is to use things like jump attacks. They might not exclusively use them, but they'd use them way more than average. This way, without even needing to pop up a single dialogue box with some character going, "Okay, now you've got to use your anti-air to," or whatever, the player would likely realize after just some basic experimentation that the most effective move to use is that anti-air move. You can even reward them by dealing extra damage by using the correct move. You don't need some kind of hyper-realistic AI to teach that concept, you just need an actually designed AI that is meant to encourage a certain pattern of play with basic or even exaggerated moves that can help a new player understand the concept on their own. And then you can incorporate those strategies into future enemies to help keep reinforcing those ideas while they move on to learning other moves. Now, sure, when it comes to the much more advanced stuff like learning about mind games, I can understand why it'd be hard to make an AI to help teach those mechanics. But I think that people that are worried about stuff like that are getting way too ahead of themselves. Why are we worried about teaching a brand new player about such advanced elements of the game when they don't even know what all the buttons do yet? And I know that there are a lot of fundamental fighting game concepts that are definitely not hard to teach because they exist in tons of other games. For example, the concept of whiff punishing or interrupting an opponent's move with a counter hit is something that is probably in every action game in existence. I mean, do I really need to come up with an example of an enemy in a game that has a big slow attack and then after you dodge you can strike back while they're vulnerable before they return to their idle stance? I mean, I think that almost every game has something like that somewhere in it. And again, you can help teach these new players these concepts through exaggerated enemies that aren't like human players because it'll help establish the concept. Maybe they use moves that are much slower than normal moves to make it easy at the start, and then over time you can ramp up the difficulty until it's as fast as the real moves are in the game. I mean, to use an example of how this can be applied in a real game, let's talk about Half-Life. Headcrab zombies are clearly designed to help teach a brand new player to first-person shooters the concept of headshots. If you attack the enemy's body, not only does it take a lot longer and thus take way more ammunition, but you still have to deal with the headcrab that crawls off of the corpse and then continues to attack you. So you're doubly encouraged to naturally go for the head to kill them faster and more efficiently. Once again, without even having to be explicitly taught how to do that with some generic pop-up or something. Now, will you ever encounter a person in an online FPS with zero ranged attacks who only slowly moves towards you and does nothing else? Probably not, but it still acts as a great teaching tool for that concept and provides the player with a good amount of practice throughout the campaign, especially as they move on to other enemies in the game that do have ranged weapons and smaller heads and move faster. And then by the end of the game, the player has gotten so much practice by just playing through the story that they're way better equipped to handle a PvP game than they would have been otherwise had they just read a guide and then dived headfirst into something like Halo multiplayer as their first game, kind of like what a fighting game would expect of you. And that's actually the other reason why I think this is so important, especially for a AAA game to do specifically. Because players really just need help getting over that initial hurdle. Once. I believe that shooters have become such a widespread genre, at least partially because they have had so many great classic single-player campaigns, ranging from games like Half-Life and Halo to Titanfall 2 and so many others, that as a result, there are tons of places for new players to shooters to learn the ropes, to the point that many games can just sort of piggyback off of those other games and should assume that anyone that wants to play a game like Overwatch has been already familiarized with basic first-person shooter mechanics thanks to one of those other classic single-player games. Overwatch never had a great tutorial either, and apparently won't ever have a proper single-player mode for that matter, but that was fine because hardly anyone played Overwatch before they had already played something else like Halo. So while I'm sure that someone has already typed up an essay in the comments about some random smaller fighting game I've never heard of before that does have a more in-depth campaign mode like what I've been describing, that might be fine for helping a specific person get into fighting games based off of a recommendation, and by all means, if you have any recommendations, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. But that's not going to help solve the issue of fighting games as a whole being niche, because the new player isn't going to stumble upon some random indie fighter as their first game. They're going to be playing with the big boys like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, and if those big games can do a great job onboarding new players into the genre, then it'll be great for the genre as a whole, as they can then use those newfound skills to branch out into other games like Tekken or Guilty Gear and raise player counts across the board. And that finally brings me to the main reason that I decided to make this video when I did, which is that it appears that Street Fighter 6 is finally doing what I've been wanting a big budget fighting game to do for years now with their new World Tour mode. To tell you the truth, I've already played the demo for that, and even though it's a very short demo that only lets you wander around the starting area for like an hour or so, I've already had way more fun playing that demo than I have had in all of my time spent trying out a bunch of other fighting games. Just like what I've been asking, they start you out with a very limited moveset. And I've noticed that most of the fighters in the starting area all do a ton of jumping where they don't even necessarily attack. And it just so happens that one of your starting moves happens to be an uppercut. Plus, they're doing some other cool stuff, like highlighting enemies when they're able to be punished, and rewarding the player for exploiting that weakness. And I've actually played through the demo twice just out of curiosity, and I already felt myself starting to improve. On my first go, I lost to the Mime and Fire Breather characters, despite being so close to them in level. But on my second go, I went straight for them, despite being a much lower level than my first attempt, and I managed to beat both of them on my first try. Also, it's important to recognize that I'm not trying to say that fighting games should be able to hold my hand all the way to a tournament or anything like that. I understand that past a certain point, a player's ability to improve will be more dependent on themselves, but I think that this notion that you have to just dive headfirst into the deep end and hope you figure out how to swim could be made so much smoother, and fighting games could be doing a lot more to help players at least get invested to the point where they can feel like they could just have fun playing the game instead of just getting their ass beat the first time they play online and going home feeling like they accomplished nothing. And I hope that if this goes well for Street Fighter, that more fighting games of the future, like Project L and the like, will also have these kinds of proper campaigns to help keep bringing in new players, until finally we can get to that point that shooters are in now, where players can have an assumed understanding of the fundamentals from past games, and more casually pick up new fighters, like how people pick up shooters in Battle Royales. So yeah, I think I want to end this video by saying that Street Fighter 6 is really shaping up to be one of, if not the best possible introductions to the genre to date, at least for new players like me, and I plan on actually going through all of World Tour mode and so on myself before graduating to actually play some proper online matches against real people. So if you want to follow me on my first real foray into fighting games, feel free to let me know down below, and maybe even leave me a like and a subscribe if that's something you want to see me make more videos about in the future. And maybe I'll even stream my journey live so that everyone can comment about how bad I am in real time. So if that's something that you want to see, make sure to let me know as well. But until next time, I will see you all later.